It's going to be an interesting first year for the Big Ten and their new television deal because there's some hoops to jump through as we just get going here in this Big Ten media deal. Which Big Ten football games are going to end up on the big three networks, Fox, CBS, and NBC? Before I get to that, just a reminder to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Big Ten content all off-season long. Always crush that like button to spread the word of Big Ten Ted to the masses. Just some parameters here to start to outline some things. Okay, NBC has 16 games. Now, there's 13 weeks in the season. I'm just going to predict their Big Ten Saturday night, that primetime game on the network. I think there's going to be some additional Peacock games in there as well. For the folks at NBC. CBS, it's their last year with the SEC, so there's only going to be 7 Big Ten games, and one of those is a Black Friday game. So here was my thinking, right? They're not going to want FCS if they have a choice of 7. They're not going to want FCS teams or G5 teams that are early in the season. Maybe games that don't mean as much. I scheduled them for the last 7 weeks of the season. That seemed to make sense to me. Not sure how they're going to work it out with the mid-afternoon and the prime time, but that's up to them. I'm not going to tackle that in this video. And of course, Fox is as Big Ten as ever. Big noon Saturday, to my understanding, is going to be all Big Ten in that time slot. All right, let's get right into it and my predictions. Week number 1. Fox is not going to start with a big noon. Instead, they're going to start on a Thursday night under the lights in Minneapolis. The first game of the Matt Rule era. Nebraska at Minnesota, I think, is a great way to start on Fox. It's going to be a very competitive game, I think, right off the bat. And then you look at the rest of these games, and West Virginia and Penn State really sticks out to me, right? A Power 5 versus Power 5. Drew Allar, good defense. I think that'd be a good selection for NBC in primetime right out the gate in week number 1. Let's head to week number 2, why don't we? And before I really continue, I just want to say I have it on pretty good authority that the top pick is going to alternate from week to week. So I started with Fox having the top pick in week number 1. And then, for example, here in week number 2, NBC is going to have their top pick. And then so on and so forth. When CBS gets in, they're all going to rotate, and they're going to have the first, second, third pick. They're all going to rotate from week to week. So here in week number 2, NBC has the top pick. And remember, when you have these non-conference games, it's the home team, and that's whatever team is at home. That's generally the way the TV rights usually go. You kind of look a lot of these teams on the road, hence why you don't see maybe an Iowa and Iowa State on here, why you don't see a Wisconsin and Washington State possibly on a network, is because those will probably belong to other networks as well. So on Fox, remember, this is Fox's last season of their Pac-12 deal. I've got Nebraska and Colorado, and that's going to be one of the most watched non-conference games. The top pick is going to NBC, and technically it's UNLV and Michigan. Got to get that big Michigan fan base and their eyeballs right away here in week number 2. Let's go to week number 3, why don't we? This is first pick to Fox, and it's Washington and Michigan State. I think both of these teams could start off the gate pretty hot. Michigan State has an easy schedule early. This is going to be a big prove-it game early on for Michigan State. If they blow the first couple of teams out of the water, can you go toe-to-toe with a team like Washington that's expected to compete for a Pac-12 championship? And then NBC, I think that's a pretty good pick for them. Penn State at Illinois. Okay, if Illinois can get past a road game against Kansas early in the season, this could be an upset alert, an early upset alert for Penn State. That defense is going to be dynamite for Illinois. This is going to be an underrated NBC game when all is said and done, I think. Let's go and advance to week number 4. And this is where things get a little weird. Now, NBC has the first pick. Okay, but they also have a Notre Dame home game, which is technically not Big Ten Saturday night. So I think here's how things are going to go. I think they're going to put Ohio State and Notre Dame big-time matchup in a mid-afternoon time slot to lead into Big Ten Saturday night, which would be Iowa and Penn State. That is some heavy hitting back-to-back on NBC. And then for the Fox game, I see Maryland and Michigan State as a possibility. Maybe if Michigan State's able to pull the upset against Washington, that might attract Fox to pick up that game as well, because I think Maryland could start the season pretty well. But I've got Rutgers and Michigan. I think Rutgers could start off pretty strong as well. And Michigan, you saw a lot of times last year where Fox picked Michigan, even though they weren't playing a great opponent, because Michigan is a team that draws a lot of eyeballs to Fox Sports. So that's what I got for week number 4. Let's advance to week number 5 as we progress here through the schedule. Fox has the top pick in this week, and boy, when you take a look at 2 Big Ten fan bases and drawing the most, doesn't get much bigger than Michigan and Nebraska. I think Nebraska is probably going to split their first 2 road games against Minnesota and Colorado. And then maybe win their next 2 games, and they'd be 3-1. And I think a lot of people would be thinking, especially if they blow out those other 2 opponents, is Nebraska for real? Can they compete with the big boys? I think that's where you see this Michigan-Nebraska big noon type of game. That game right there, especially if Nebraska 3-1. Oh, can you imagine if Nebraska wins their first 2 and they're 4-0? Going undefeated Nebraska, undefeated Michigan, yeah, that's going to draw and pop a big rating. I kind of look at the other games here. I picked Michigan State and Iowa for the primetime game, especially if Michigan State, this could be a big game, especially if Michigan State can get past Iowa. I saw Illinois and Purdue. I just don't think Purdue is going to start off that strong. I don't think they match up great against their first 3 opponents on a non-conference schedule. So I think Michigan State and Iowa fits in pretty nicely for NBC's primetime matchup. Now, week 6 would be the last week where it's just Fox and just NBC. Week 6, NBC has first pick, and I think Maryland-Ohio State is going to be a good game. It was a great game last season, and I think Maryland's going to start off pretty strong. They have a pretty backloaded schedule. Early in the season, I think they're going to show their prowess. They're going to put up some points, and this could be a game where a lot of points are scored between Maryland and Ohio State over there on NBC. And then it's not very often these days where you see the little brown jug on the line. I got Michigan and Minnesota, especially if Minnesota, if they beat Nebraska, or even if they lose to Nebraska, they lose to North Carolina, even if they're something like a 2-loss team, something like 3-2 coming into this game, I still think that is a game that can draw some people, where maybe Minnesota, close losses, maybe they can hang with the Michigan team. I look at Nebraska, Illinois, that could possibly be in there as well. That would not surprise me to see Michigan and Illinois, especially if Illinois gets off to a hot start on Fox. But I went with the rivalry game, Michigan and Minnesota, a matchup we don't see that much anymore. All right, week 7, this is where things get fun. This is where CBS comes into the fold, and we're going to be nice to CBS and give them the first pick when they first join here in week number 7. And this is going to be a big matchup. Iowa and Wisconsin, I think, are going to get off to a nice start, especially Wisconsin. Iowa's got a couple of tricky games, and they got Penn State in there. They got Michigan State in there. They could trip up a few times, but I think this could probably be a 1-loss Iowa team against maybe an undefeated Wisconsin team. I think a lot of people are going to look at Wisconsin and say their schedule not that great to start. This might be the first true challenge for the Badgers, and CBS is going to get a treat between Iowa and Wisconsin. I think that could be a really intriguing matchup over there. Fox would have second pick. They take Indiana and Michigan, and then Ohio State and Purdue. Okay, Purdue's although I don't think they're going to have a great record at this point in the season, Purdue's a great environment on television in primetime under the lights at Ross-Ade Stadium. Over to week 8 as we continue throughout the Big Ten season. NBC first pick, and this is not much of a decision. Penn State, Ohio State, going to be one of the most anticipated games under the lights. This is always a fun. I don't think these two are maybe bitter rivals, so to speak, but this is always a competitive game, and this is an easy pick for NBC. It is going to be one of the biggest ratings draws probably during the season for NBC that particular week. CBS with second pick. I've got Michigan State, especially following up with what happened last year. Maybe Michigan State can pull off a few upsets. They're going to be probably floating right around a 500 team at this point in the season, and even a 500 team against an undefeated Michigan, especially Michigan State, I think that could draw a lot of eyeballs on CBS. And then I took the rivalry game. I took Minnesota and Iowa. on Fox. I think this could be this is always a good game, and the storyline, can PJ Fleck finally beat Kirk Ferentz is there. I look at Wisconsin, Illinois. I know that could probably fit in as well, right? Illinois was the team that beat Wisconsin that led to them firing their head coach last year. I could possibly see that as well as the Fox game, but I'm going with the rivalry. I'm going with the Floyd-Rosedale. I'm going with Minnesota and Iowa to be the game that ends up on Fox. Wisconsin and Illinois could very well be that FS1 type of game right there as well. Let's move on to week number 9. In week number 9, Fox has the number 1 pick. And once again, this is a pretty easy pick. Ohio State and Wisconsin, especially if Wisconsin can get by Iowa, a couple of weeks before and really solidify themselves. This could possibly be close to a top 10 matchup between the Buckeyes and the Badgers. It'd be Ryan Day's first visit to Camp Randall, so there's a lot that could especially go on here, especially if Wisconsin is gelling on offense. This could be, they could really sell this as a big offensive showdown between the Badgers and the Buckeyes. In week number 9, I have NBC as the number 2 pick. I got Purdue and Nebraska. We know the kind of ratings that Nebraska draws. We know that they can bring in a fan base as well. I just don't see a ton of other great matchups. Michigan State and Minnesota could be a decent matchup. Purdue and Nebraska, though, put up some big-time numbers in their Big Ten Network game last season. So I'm going with Purdue and Nebraska. And then Indiana, Penn State. Indiana's kind of a team that could maybe surprise if Taven Jackson and the Hoosiers can get it together. But Penn State is a team that I think is going to be rolling at this point in the season. I think CBS is going to want to get in on those Penn State eyeballs. Let's move ahead to week number 10. First pick, CBS, talking about Penn State. I think Maryland could have lost maybe 2 or 3 times by now, but they could also be a 1-loss team, a 2-loss team. This could be a pretty big game in College Park. This could be another upset alert for Penn State, I believe. And I think if you kind of look at it from top to bottom, I think Penn State and Maryland is probably the game of the week in here as well. I look at Fox having the number 2 pick, Big Ten Championship rematch between Purdue and Michigan over there, and then NBC primetime. I like Nebraska and Michigan State. I think that's a good matchup. I think both those teams are going to be floating around 500, so that's why I took Michigan. Fox seems to love Michigan, right? Even if they're playing not great teams, I think Fox and Michigan have been a good pairing for each other, so Nebraska and Michigan State. I moved that over to NBC. I could see the Chicago game. You see the Wrigley Field game between Iowa and Northwestern. Because of the uniqueness, I could see a network possibly picking that up. Illinois and Minnesota could be a good one as well in week number 10 for a network to pick up. But that's why we have diversity in television, right? All right, week number 11. First pick is the primetime game on NBC. This is going to be the whiteout. And this is, especially this late in the season, this is going to be a matchup that the executives at NBC are going to be drooling over. Michigan and Penn State, this could be an undefeated versus undefeated if Penn State is able to beat Ohio State early in the season. Even if Penn State loses, there's still a lot on the line in Happy Valley in this matchup. No question about it. That's the primetime game on NBC when they have their first pick. CBS up next. I got Michigan State and Ohio State. Yeah, I mean, you kind of look around. Not a ton of great games this week. I think Michigan State, most of the year, is probably going to be floating around 500. And maybe there could be a game where they could pull an upset. Maybe this is the game. Maybe that's how they market this particular matchup. Maryland and Nebraska, they're both going to be fighting for things. They're both going to be probably a couple of games back in their respective division races. But once again, this is not a matchup that we're probably going to see a lot, even beyond going into 2024 and beyond. So I think that could attract some things right there on Fox to kick things off on that particular Saturday. Last 2 weeks of the season. Let's go to week number 12. First pick goes to Fox. And I believe Nebraska could be in a position. They might be a couple of games back, and they might be in a spoiler position, especially if Wisconsin does what we think they're going to do this season. I think this could be a big time game late in the season, especially if this is going to be a bigger game, especially if Nebraska can maybe pull off a few upsets. So I got Nebraska and Wisconsin on Fox. NBC as second pick. They're going defense. Illinois and Iowa. I think this is going to be a big weekend for the Big Ten West. Okay, I think Illinois and Iowa, Nebraska and Wisconsin, teams are going to separate themselves before rivalry weekend. This is going to be a weekend where things are decided. I think you look at those 4 teams in the West, probably 2 of those teams are going to get eliminated. It's high stakes. That's what these networks is all about. That's what draws the eyeballs in. Michigan and Maryland, I have wrapping things up there on CBS. Could see Minnesota, Ohio State. Could see Rutgers, Penn State. That wouldn't surprise me either. Final rivalry weekend, Thanksgiving Saturday. Remember, CBS is the Black Friday game. And, well, there's one Black Friday game, and that's Iowa and Nebraska. I think there could be some things on the line. Can Nebraska play spoiler again if Iowa's in a position to compete with Wisconsin for the Big Ten West Championship? Next pick would be Fox, and, of course, it's Ohio State, Michigan. They might have something in their contract that says we got the Ohio State-Michigan game. And then I had a kind of tough time deciding here, but I got Wisconsin and Minnesota. I think Minnesota, once again, going to be floating around 500, could possibly play spoiler. Same type of deal with Penn State and Michigan State. If Penn State's in a position, right, where they've got big wins earlier in the season, Michigan State on the road. That's kind of a tough decision for NBC. I think you can't go wrong, but I went with the better rivalry game with Wisconsin and Minnesota. So all of that being said, what does this show us? Right, some people have been saying, and we're saying, well, Ted, with these 3 networks, the quality of games is going to be diluted a little bit. And you saw, there's going to be some weeks where you got Michigan against Indiana, you got Penn State against Rutgers. In some weeks, there's going to be that. But most weeks, you're going to have competitive, ranked football in the Big Ten on Fox, on CBS, on NBC. Let me know your thoughts. Would there be any other games that you'd maybe flip around? And what are your thoughts in general now that you see it laid out? Doesn't it look pretty fun seeing these matchups all across the day on any given Saturday? Leave your thoughts in the comments below on all things Big Ten games on the big 3 networks. It's going to be fun. I'm so excited for the first year of this new television deal. Subscribe to the channel also if you haven't already. I'm Big Ten Ted. We'll see you in the next one.